The views expressed in this podcast are solely our own. This information is provided for your convenience. It does not constitute legal advice, nor does it create an attorney-client relationship. Prior results do not guarantee similar outcomes. This is attorney advertising. Enjoy. Hi, welcome again to Red Flags Rising. My name is Mike Hunnicky. I'm a partner in Morgan, Lewis & Bacchius's international trade and national security practice in Washington, D.C. With me, as always, is my good friend Brent Carlson of Red Flags Rising Solutions, LLC. Brent, today is Tuesday, December 9th, just after 3:30 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time. How are you doing today?
Excellent, Mike, as always.
Well, Brent, we're never at a loss for topics here on Red Flags Rising, given the dynamic nature of geopolitics and national politics and, frankly, even enforcement. Where do you want to start today?
Well, Mike, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about a couple key stories that would be elephants in the room. Number one is the new policy decision that allows for advanced AI chips to be sold to China. On the same day, there was an announcement from the DOJ on the arrest and guilty plea with some individuals who were engaged in smuggling of those very same chips. Obviously, there's a time lag. The actions underlying the DOJ activity, those go back over a year. So there's a little bit of time delay, but it's interesting that you have these coinciding at the same time. It reflects the fluid world that we're in and the uncertainty that we're all facing. Like, where is this going? Which direction are these going to go? Is everything okay now? Is everything not okay now? And always it's the lawyer interpretation. Well, it depends. But I think one thing to think about, we'll get to in the second part of the program, is frameworks. When you have uncertainty and it's highly fluid, we all need a framework. We need frameworks to be able to build the platform that we stand upon to address these issues in an effective way. We've got a new innovative take on a classic formula that's been used in the fraud detection and prevention world that has some important lessons. But why don't we go back to these news stories, because the buzz on these has been so loud. I can hear it from here. I can kind of hear it. Santa Clara is down that way. I can get a little buzz from that direction as well. And maybe even from all the way from DC over to the east as well.
Those are probably just the air taxis and delivery drones you might be hearing, Brent, but certainly there is something in the air. Maybe starting with the arrests that were announced just the other day by U.S. authorities taking down a very large smuggling network. Coincidentally, as you pointed out, the chips that were being smuggled included the very same chips that the administration announced yesterday they would allow shipment with a 25% revenue cut. The smugglers' problem was not only that they didn't make the 25% revenue cut, but it's your classic case of burning red flags. It involves a 24-hour massage parlor in Brooklyn as the front company for manpower that was removing labels indicating U.S. design of these chips and replacing it with a made-up name that sort of kind of sounds like the Malaysian word for pirate, although it's spelled a little bit differently. It involves illegal immigration across the Texas border by computer engineers to do this. It involves a front company in Houston whose name includes Global LLC that claimed to be the end user. It's a very tangled web. These arrests were the result of a multi-agency operation called Operation Gatekeeper. Certainly when we see things like this that involve a lot of coordination and joint action across multiple agencies in the U.S. government, we're not expecting to just see one case come out of it. There are 3 individuals involved here with their associated companies. Frankly, Brent, I would expect more. Coming back to the decision by the administration to allow still further chips to go to China, the higher revenue cut, 25%, than the 15% cut on the, I guess now, especially obsolete chips that we talked about a few weeks ago. What's your take on that deal?
The devil's in the details. The administration wants a compromise struck here between commercial interests and national security interests. Part of the issue on the commercial interest side is that commercial interests are part of economic security. Without passing judgment or taking a side either way, that's how it was presented. This was a compromise. So these particular chips, they're not the most advanced, the latest generation. They're about 18 months behind or so. It's not the leading cutting edge. It's just behind it. One thing to keep in mind in all this is that technology is continuously advancing. So those particular technological threshold lines, they're going to be rolling lines. They're going to be changing all the time. Cutting edge today is going to be obsolete tomorrow. That's always going to be evolving. Everybody keep that in mind when we talk about frameworks and how to have an approach to deal with that. Keep that in mind. That's just really important. The other thing that I thought was really interesting was the issue is that these sales, it's not just a free-for-all either. It's not just opening the door and whoever can pull up a truck and we'll load them in there for you. No, it's going to quote unquote approved customers. What that's going to mean is going to be hashed out in the details by the Commerce Department and folks in the administration who will come out with those details. Because look, nobody in the administration going all the way up to the President of the United States wants to be made to look like a fool or a sucker in any of this stuff. So everybody's going to be going in eyes wide open.
Brent, that's really the key point. And that's the point that makes these two newsworthy developments consistent with each other, even though at headline level, they might appear to be significantly inconsistent with each other. Who are the approved customers? Obviously, we'll have to wait and see. There may actually be more restriction than the current end user restrictions, for example, for military intelligence, or WMD end uses. What this actually looks like is still very much up in the air. And frankly, as the CEO of the company involved himself said, he doesn't know what China is going to actually want to buy under the circumstances. We saw with the prior authorization that they actually didn't want to buy the chips that were offered them at that time. I'm sure it didn't help that they were told it would make them addicted to American technology. I'm sure it didn't help that there were reports of how the U.S. intelligence community might be leveraging the fact of those chips being exported to China in terms of tracking and monitoring. A lot to still be seen, Brent.
A couple of points from the Chinese perspective in all this. China's overall development plan for the last 40 years has been to establish self-sufficiency and not to be beholden to foreign interests in areas it sees are critical for its economic security, for its technological security. This is a rolling target. This is constantly evolving, but keep in mind that they are looking to establish self-sufficiency as well. It was already a priority for a very long time. We're living in the whole new world. The whole world has changed. That world order that we saw at the end of World War II is now being totally changed. You can see that reflected a bit in the new national security strategy of the United States that just came out as well. And there's been a lot of reactions on that. No matter how that's going to get shaken out, it does reflect that there's been a sea change.
It reminds me again of the impossible triad that we've mentioned a few times. This is a phrase coined by Eddie Fishman in his book, Choke Points, which we'll put in the show notes. At the end of the book, when he's talking about why is the world basically tearing itself apart, it's because we're shifting from a space where 25 years ago, there was a, let's say, moderate consensus, maybe a strong consensus, that the national security interests of everyone involved was more interdependency from an economic perspective. That was our objective because we thought it would serve our interests. It shouldn't really be surprising anyone that both the United States and China are actually acting very much the same right now in seeing that economic security turn into insecurity and responding to that insecurity by tearing down the interdependence. That's the fundamental aspect of the impossible triad that Eddie Fishman describes in his book. You know, Brent, this leads us to an interesting concept that you were explaining to me and I thought was really important to get on a podcast episode because I think it'll be interesting to a lot of people. That concept is to take the fraud triangle that we speak of frequently in any type of compliance community, whether that's anti-corruption compliance, trade compliance, as a framework for understanding why people take the risk to do bad things or to do illegal things. And that classic fraud triangle is essentially pieced together from the work of Edward Sutherland and others. He's the professor who coined the phrase white collar crime, and he spent a lot of his time trying to understand why otherwise well-meaning and law-abiding people would do heinous things when in a corporation together. There you have pressure, opportunity, and rationalization. You feel the pressure to make a sale, to hit your targets. You see the opportunity to do so, whether that's by circumventing a compliance program or operating without one. And then over time, you try to rationalize your behavior, frankly, to yourself and then to others. But Brent, tell us a little bit more about that triangle and the concept you're going to explain in this episode, a better framework for thinking about real-time, forward-looking views about risk.
Absolutely. This kind of follows on the theme of our last episode of back to basics. And again, when we're in periods of uncertainty and rapid change, go back to the fundamentals and look at them, think about them critically, thoughtfully, and see how they can be best applied to each one of our current situations to help us navigate the road ahead. This is what I thought was really interesting. I'm a big fan of the fraud triangle. I'm a fan. Shout out to the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. That's a great organization. It's put out a lot of great material over the years, and I hope we can all continue and also evolve with the different types of frauds that are out there as we we go forward. Now, the fraud triangle, as you mentioned, is a classic in the white collar world, in the compliance world. And you mentioned those three elements: pressure, opportunity, and rationalization. These points came together in a study that was done by Donald Cressy, who is one of Sutherland's students, I believe. He did this study by interviewing convicted embezzlers in prison because he was getting at, okay, what are the driving factors? What is going to lead them to commit this fraud? So Donald Cressy did this in his study of convicted embezzlers sitting in prison. And he came up with these points through these interviews. These three factors: the pressure, opportunity, and rationalization, they really do fit. When we're thinking about this, though, from a legal compliance role today and looking forward, how can we apply this? One of the problems is, what do you do with rationalization? Because usually we're sitting in situations where you're not getting the full information. You may go and you may do a risk assessment, or you've got an internal audit going on, or you've got a due diligence exercise going on. Bad actors are not going to be forthcoming about their bad actions.
Brent, is what you're getting at there that it wasn't a flaw of the study because it was an acknowledged parameter of the study, but that when you're talking to people who have already done something bad and gotten caught, rationalization is a coping mechanism that they're naturally going to look to for, frankly, just solace, right?
Absolutely.
But when you're in real time trying to think about in the current moment, or frankly, from a going forward perspective, how are people thinking so that you can better stop them? That's slightly different. And is that what you're getting at?
Yes, that's right. That's not to call into question the study, the results of the study, or the methodology of the study. It's just the application is different. And you hit the nail on the head. After the fact, when a person who has committed fraud has been caught, they have, especially if they're sitting in prison, all the time in the world to rationalize their behavior in some way, shape, or form. Now, when we're dealing it in real time, before that has happened, you don't get that admission. You don't have that admission that they've done something wrong. If somebody's trying to pull a fast one or commit some sort of fraud, they're not going to admit it to you, or if they've done something wrong that's not compliant with the policies and procedures of the company, they're not going to admit that. So thinking and building upon the classic fraud triangle, what are other factors that we can look at? Again, building on that foundation, that classic foundation, but also applying real-time experience and practical hands-on experience over the years in dealing with these types of situations. What else should we be looking for that can help us construct a framework that can help assess these potential fraud risks, potential compliance risks, enhance our compliance programs, and also protect the company from a range of different types of fraud that may be perpetrated by bad actors, potentially internally and externally. Why don't we jump into these additional factors and lay that out? So pressure, we still keep pressure because it's always there. I mean, and I kind of laugh sometimes because it's like, tell me a job these days that doesn't have any pressure. It's intense and seems like it's ever increasing. My dad was really funny. He said, like, look, even if you're digging a ditch, you're going to have somebody telling you to dig faster. So pressure is always there in any environment. The second thing is the opportunity. And the opportunity is also a necessary factor as well. They have to be able to have the means to commit some type of fraud. One of the things to look at for both the pressure and the opportunity is how things have changed over time. Has pressure changed over time? One of the things that we look at when you're looking at it from, let's say, a qualitative perspective is, has things changed where there are more pressures now based upon what else is going on in the business or what else is going on in a particular person's team or a particular industry that may indicate that there's something there. Look at what changes happen. Same thing on the opportunity side. Is there something that's come in? Have there been new doors that have opened, new businesses that have opened? Like a post-merger acquisition situation, there's sort of a point where you've got different and potentially conflicting compliance policies and procedures that need to be addressed. Is there something that's changed in this relevant time period, in this critical time period, that you want to be thinking about? All right, so we got pressure, we got opportunity. Now we're going to get rid of rationalization because that's something after the fact. What do we replace it with? I have two factors that I add. Instead of a triangle, we're going to make a diamond. So you've got pressure, you've got opportunity. Now we're going to add something almost too good to be true that comes at a critical time for the business. I say almost too good to be true. It's like, look, miracles can and do happen. Wonderful things can happen. That big deal comes in the door. That's part of life and business. So it's not to say that, oh, it never happens. We're just, some sourpuss out there being negative. Miracles can and do happen. But be careful of the wily one bearing gifts at the right time. If you start to ask yourself, wow, this is almost too good to be true, at this time. That's when you really have to start peeling it back and to verify. It's an old Soviet quote, trust but verify. You want to trust but verify, especially when it's coming at a critical time of the business. What do I mean by a critical time at the business? It is where, look, you have revenue pressure, you have margin pressure. You've got to get this deal in. Your career's on the line, the company's on the line, people could lose their jobs, the company could go out of business. There will be a critical point, or even if it's not a bet the company type of situation, there's a lot of pressure to like, we got to make this close now. We got to get this. This has got to be wrapped up this quarter. This has got to be wrapped up before the end of the fiscal year. It comes at a critical time. So that's where something almost too good to be true comes at a very critical time for the business. Bad actors, people who perpetrate fraud, the good ones, they can smell it. They can smell vulnerability. Make sure that you're protecting yourselves, the company's shareholders from being taken as a fool or a sucker. Nobody wants to have that happen to them. The last factor to look for are signs of concealment. What do I mean by that? All fraud is hidden. The true nature of the transaction, the parties, the underlying activity should be completely transparent. If there are any indications of a lack of transparency, that would be a sign of concealment, and that would be something to look into and to be very careful about. So they all kind of come together, pressure, opportunity, something almost too good to be true that comes at a critical time for the business, and then signs of concealment. Are there gaps or discrepancies in due diligence on ultimate ownership or representations made from these counterparties that just don't jive up? Is there like a move to change business communications, or is it just something strange? Because when somebody's being totally upfront and transparent, they have nothing to hide. Why would you kind of go through motions to try to put any sort of signs of concealment on it? If you do get a sense of any of that, that's something to take a careful look a little bit better. So those are the 4 areas. I'll pause there. Then I can give an example of a real case where that applied. And then we can talk about a little bit on how perhaps trade compliance teams could apply this framework as well.
I really like that framework, Brent, because it strikes me as very realistic. We tell clients to look at what is really the underlying economics, what's actually happening. Or when you hear us on many episodes say substance over form, that allows you to cut through the fog of whatever obfuscation or shenanigans people are deploying in order to hide what's really happening from you. I really like it, Brent. It's an interesting concept and seems very much like the types of pressures that many of our listeners who sit in-house as trade professionals or on sales teams have seen play out in real life, undoubtedly many times too many.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let me give you an example. And this comes from a complex commercial fraud dispute. This was an M&A dispute. A merger and acquisition occurred. I was working for a U.S. buyer that bought a private equity-backed company. Right after deal closing, the target company took a nosedive. They were scratching their heads going, what is going on here? They couldn't figure it out. What was happening and what really threw everybody off was there was a mysterious payment of cash into the company that occurred just before deal closing, but happened actually in between due diligence and deal closing. That might give people a clue, but it threw people off because they're like, wait a minute, if somebody wants to steal from the company, why are they putting money in? They put cash in, and they just couldn't understand it. Let's roll through this story from the framework of the Fraud Diamond and these 4 factors. It was a tough nut to crack, and this framework actually helped. And it really helps in situations, especially when you don't have a clear smoking gun. You don't have a piece of evidence right there that's a manifesto of a particular fraud scheme or a compliance override or something like that. That cash in, what it did, it actually prevented the target company from going to a net loss in the few months right before deal closing. That cash was actually paid in from one of the former CEO's other companies. So he paid that in. That kept the target company in the black in the period right up to deal closing. So you wouldn't face potential material adverse change clause issues. So pressure. Let's talk about pressure. This was a private equity-backed company that needed to complete this sale to this U.S. multinational buyer. The private equity firm wanted to get out and get liquidity, and the CEO wanted to cash out and get liquidity as well. That's where we get to that point of why did that cash go in? Because that allowed him to complete the sale. He made millions of dollars on this by doing that. He pays in a couple million, he gets out a few tens of million. Now, let's talk about opportunity. The main perpetrator in all this was that CEO. He was in charge of all the operations of the company. He was in the position that had the ultimate opportunity to impact the company's books and records. He ran the whole team, he ran the whole operation. He could direct people to do certain things. Number three, something almost too good to be true that comes at a critical time for the company. Here we have two aspects of this cash collection that came in ostensibly from a multinational client. The other issue facing the company is that they were actually under a longer term downward pressure on margins. So their business was getting squeezed competitively. That's why it's important when we look at things, let's look at them holistically. Look at what else is going on in the overall business. How is that impacting particular business units, particular geographies, particular sales teams? That can give you an indication on where those pressures may lie and where you want to focus your time on, where there may be the greatest risks. By the way, this company, they had a reputable auditor. There's a reputable company that came in to do the due diligence, but they missed these things. That happens. This magic new business came on the scene that had 100% margin. And you kind of go, wait a minute. There was like no cost of business.
Sorry,
to this thing.
100%?
Yes, 100%. It was all cash, all money, all profit. That alone should just raise red flags in any experienced business person. You go, come on, really? It wasn't theoretically impossible. But again, just our reaction, just listen to it now as we talk about it, you kind of think, wait a minute, come on. So you'd want to be verifying that. You want to make sure that you've got sufficient supporting documentation verified and cross-verified that this is actually real. Because then what was happening at the same time, there was an increasing bubble of accounts receivable that were not being collected. These are nuts and bolts of running a business. I think that's where a lot of times folks fall down, and sometimes we miss these things because we're overthinking it and not going back to those basics. And you go, wait a minute, it just goes back to those fundamentals. Something too good to be true. You had this cash payment coming in, you had this margin business that was helping to keep margins afloat, all leading up to this M&A deal. Last one was this signs of concealment. Even looking at that one cash transaction just a couple months before deal closing, nobody could figure it out. It was booked as from this other major client, but if you look at the bank information, it's coming from company X, which is another one of this founder CEO's companies. Something's funny there. Something funky is there. It's helpful to take a step back because sometimes people assume one thing is happening. Here, people assume, oh, it's some sort of embezzlement or something. Why would somebody put money in? That's basically it. If you apply pressure, opportunity, something just too good to be true that comes at a critical time for the company, and then signs of concealment, that helped put together that case for that client, and we got to a successful arbitration resolution on that.
Right, and it's never popular, right? It's never fun.
Legal and compliance professionals and the chief risk officers, it can be a lonely job because it is their job to point out these risks. It's human nature where we don't want to face these things, especially when we're all excited and juiced up about some big deal happening. Sometimes it takes a lot of courage just for people that are in the risk profession and the legal and compliance teams out there to be able to stand up and just say, look, we've got to pay attention to this to protect the company.
Now, Brent, pivoting to our core audience, how might the Fraud Diamond Framework apply specifically to people in the world of trade compliance?
Definitely this can help out when you're in a due diligence situation or a risk assessment situation. We began our Fresh Looks series of articles on NYU Law School's Program on Corporate Compliance and Enforcement blog. When I wrote that original article, When Loopholes Create Liability Pitfalls, it started because I was following in the press news about a particular company got on the entity list, and then there was shifting to other subsidiaries and affiliates of that new entity listed company. And I thought, wait a minute, that just doesn't quite make sense either. So I took a look at the EAR, and I also took a look from that perspective of that fraud diamond. It was quite illuminating. What the teams can do in the trade compliance functions at companies is when you're in these situations and you're doing due diligence on a new prospective customer, or you're refreshing it, or you're doing a risk assessment, think about applying these aspects, these four elements. Again, pressure, opportunity, something almost too good to be true that comes at a critical time, and number four, signs of concealment. Think about that as a framework to help you put together your data points. Because a lot of times in life, there isn't a clear-cut answer. You're not going to get a definite yes or no. What you do and what you can use these frameworks for is to create a mosaic. Each individual data point on its own may not tell you a whole lot. That's why you don't get a clear-cut yes or no answer. But when you take these data points in the framework and you put them together, a clear picture can emerge from them in their entirety. That's how this can help.
Brent, that brings us to managing up for this episode. What is your managing up tip for the day?
Yeah, issues and stress come for legal and compliance teams from all angles at all times these days. So it's really important to build a solid platform to stand upon where you can address and communicate these issues, the policies, procedures, and how they fit in with the strategic goals of the company. So build your own platform. Use these frameworks, like we talked about the Fraud Diamond here on this episode. Like we've talked about the high probability protocol to run through the trade compliance program that incorporates the full definition of knowledge under the export administration regulations. Use these because then you've got a framework that is thoughtful, smart, and brings consistency, resiliency, and strength to your platform. It shores up your compliance toolkit in the areas that it needs most. That's where we all need to be. We all need to be optimistic about the path going forward. So how do we do that? We've laid it out. And we'd be glad to compare notes with anybody offline who'd like to explore that further.
Brent, the only thing that we can be certain about is that there's going to be more uncertainty, more surprises. The world is not going to get less volatile in 2026. It's all the more important to have a solid framework that you design and implement to help navigate these challenging times. Well, Brent, that concludes this episode of Red Flags Rising. As always, be well.
Thanks, Mike. Be well. And to everyone else out there, be well.